And today we're going to try to answer a question, and it's one of a series in this month. We're dealing with, including climate change, war and conflict, and ultimately death. But today we're going to be talking about pain and suffering. This is an informal session, so you are welcome to make any comments at some particular point. Well, our world is one in which pain and suffering are everyday occurrences, part of the very fabric of life itself, whether at home or abroad, near or far. We cannot escape the sights and sounds of suffering, whether in wars, such as the one going on in Russia, in Ukraine, with Russia in conflict, natural disasters, bushfires in Europe being one example of recent events, criminal activity, and so on. The increased speed of communication brings home to us the sheer scale, as we learn often in real time, of those millions in both human and animal domains that suffer every day. When these events are close to us, they heighten our own sensitivity to the issues that pain and suffering raise. Well, the brutal truth is that pain and suffering happen to us all. There's no discrimination between male and female, young and old. Details may vary, but we're all sailing in the same boat. The next image is a very recent one, and it's of children suffering from famine in Ethiopia, which, along with Yemen, has had its worst drought in many years. And this only came to light via a news item earlier this week. Quite often, these events are buried beneath other so-called more important news. Well, this is the plan for the seminar. We'd like to look at the origins of pain and suffering. To answer the question, is everything bad? Talk about time and chance. Answer the question, what should God do? And ultimating in, as our subject title suggests, God's solutions. Well, we'll now refer to pain and suffering as a singular word, suffering. It is a major problem, one that cannot be overemphasized. It is often cited as being in conflict with the notion of God being all-powerful and caring, to which people often conclude that either God doesn't exist, or he exists, or he is unable or unwilling to prevent disaster, disease, illness, or pain, all of which have no real purpose, thus calling into question his motivation, his character, and his integrity. And I've put on this slide, for those that can see it, a couple of images of recent natural disasters. On the left, landslide, and on the right, wildfire, both of which occurred in the United States, which, to my surprise, actually has the most natural disasters in any country in the world. Now, in times of disaster or premature death, people typically ask questions that raise human existence to the highest level, describing others as innocent, with the assumption that man has a right to life. Well, it's important for us to understand the facts that now follow, however unpleasant or unpalatable they may be. We were not created because we have a right to exist, but from God's mercy and goodness, Life is a gift. Human beings are not at all innocent. The Bible states that we are essentially selfish and possess sinful natures, and sin is disobedience to God's laws, which are set out in detail in his book, the Bible. And I'd like to suggest that it's important to reflect on these issues before we go on and look at the root causes. All of the Bible quotations in this presentation are from the New International Version. So we look at the origins of pain and suffering. As last week's speaker in the Bible Talk, Simon, pointed out, the Bible tells us that Adam and Eve were the first man and woman in recorded history, and that they were given free rein in the idyllic place in which they lived, the Garden of Eden, their marvelous and trouble-free residence. They were only given one rule, which was that they should not eat of a particular tree in their garden home. Although they were warned of the consequences of breaking this rule, they broke it nonetheless and brought into play God's judgment, which has left its mark on the human race ever since. The content and tone of God's response was in sharp contrast to the idyllic life in Eden. Apart from being consigned to death, eventual, not an immediate event, and this being an element in the suffering process, there would be trouble ahead. This is what we read. Genesis chapter 3 from verse 16. To the woman he said, I will make your pains in childbearing very severe. With painful labor you will give birth to children. Your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you. To Adam he said, because you listened to your wife and ate fruit from the tree about which I commanded you, you must not eat from it. Cursed is the ground because of you. Through painful toil, you will eat food from it all the days of your life. It will produce thorns and thistles for you, and you will eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your brow, you will eat your food until you return to the ground, since from it you were taken. For dust you are, and to dust you will return. Having inherited their nature, men and women are subject to the same challenges. Life with difficulties leading in the end to death. This is what, going to the New Testament, Paul, who was an ardent believer in Jesus and one of his followers, had this to say in Romans chapter 5, verse 12. Therefore, just as sin entered the world through one man, that is Adam and Eve, and death through sin, and in this way death came to all people because all sinned. So I ask this question on the next slide. Is this the end? And it's an emphatic no. Well, after Eden, was life all bad? God has continued in the years since our forebears, Adam and Eve, to provide for human needs. In the New Testament, Paul, again, observed that God's provision of our daily necessities was an indication of his presence. This is from Acts chapter 14. And he prefaced the words that I will read from, talking about the fact that there was a living God who made the heavens and earth and everything in it. And he then goes on to say, he has not left himself without testimony. He has shown kindness by giving you rain from heaven and crops in their seasons. He provides you with plenty of food and fills your heart with joy. And also Jesus himself on The speech known as the Sermon on the Mount said this: Father, send rain on the just and the unjust. Testament. And Psalm 33 and verse 5, the earth is full of the goodness of the Lord. The fact is that God has established a natural order in which joy and suffering both play a part. Men and women experience both without there necessarily being a specific ratio according to their good or bad behavior. Our quote from Matthew gives us some feeling for us. God sends rain on the just and the unjust. So we'll move on now and talk about time and chance. The law of time and chance eluded even Jesus' own followers, his disciples, that close group of friends, when they came across a man born blind. Like the Pharisees, who were a group of religious leaders in those days, they assumed that his disability was the result of someone's past disobedience to God's commands. And this is the question they asked Jesus. John chapter 9 verse 2, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Jesus pointed out that they were looking at it in the wrong way. He replied, neither this man nor his parents sinned, said Jesus, but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. Jesus pointed out, yes, that they were looking at it in the wrong way. The incident enabled him to demonstrate his healing power, not because of some major shortcoming on the part of the blind man or his family. As God's Son, Jesus was invested with power like no other before or in the years that closely followed prior to the end of the first century, or indeed in the years since. A similar conclusion can be drawn from the incident that the Apostle Luke records in his account of the Gospel. It's chapter 13 from verse 1. Now there was some present at that time who told Jesus about the Galileans, whose blood Pilate had mixed with their sacrifices. Jesus answered, do you think that these Galileans were worse sinners than all the other Galileans because they suffered this way? I tell you no, but unless you repent, you too will all perish. All those 18 who died when the tower in Siloam fell on them, do you think they were more guilty than all the others living in Jerusalem? I tell you no, but unless you repent, you too will all perish. Now, the reference there to Pilate, for those who may be wondering what it is, he was a guy called Pontius Pilate. He was a ruler at Rome's behest over the province of Judea. What is Jesus saying here? Neither group of victims were especially selected to die. God can terminate life, but he doesn't usually interfere with the natural order, the flood in the time of Noah being an exception. Death and suffering do not discriminate. Mankind is governed by the law of time and chance. As Solomon, who was the wise and third king of Israel, said, Ecclesiastes 9, verse 11, I've seen something else under the sun, nor does food come to the wise, or wealth to the brilliant, or favor to the learned, but time and chance happen to them all. Well, before we move on to the next section, are there any questions at this point? Okay, I'll move on then. We're going to talk about what should God do. Now, most people will accept Solomon's argument that we've got here on the screen, if not always for the right reasons. Human nature, though, is so perverse, which most, but not all, people enjoy. On the other hand, he wants protection from illness and other aspects of suffering. Even when he has ignored God for most of his life, man is still inclined to ask for his help in times of crisis. In addition, he often blames God when life turns sour. So, what should God do? I'd like to ask this question. How can man justify blaming God when many of life's ills result from man's own stupidity or selfishness? Many of today's germs and diseases are caused by a man's self-abuse, such as AIDS, or other factors, such as COVID. And the body will rebel against these things. Looking at AIDS, it has rather less publicity than, say, 10 years ago, but it is man's own fault. It is suggested that a third of the African population is HIV positive. Illnesses which cause suffering have often been created by man's past thoughtless actions. Man is no better now, arguably worse. God has given man responsibility. So why should God be considered responsible? Take a number of earthquakes or mudslides, such as the picture we saw earlier. How often do buildings collapse due to poor construction? How often have they been built against a backcloth of corruption? Take war and its consequences. I know it's a subject that is in this series, so I'll briefly touch on it. It is said that only a few days since World War II have existed without a war being fought somewhere in the world. Who creates war? Is it God? James, in his letter, answers the question. What causes fights and quarrels among you? Don't they come from your desires that battle within you? You desire and do not have, so you kill. You covet, but you cannot get what you want, so you quarrel and fight. You do not have because you do not ask God. Man creates his own problems. If God did not allow suffering, he would have to withdraw all willpower and responsibility. We will become robots. Having freedom of choice, man can still decide between right and wrong and face the consequences. So we'll move on now to part of the headline, God's solutions. The Bible shows us that whilst God lets life run its own course, he is not indifferent to the effects of suffering upon mankind. Indeed, for those who come to know and obey him, there are solutions. Another law called providence operates in this life to protect from certain dangers and crises, as well as in more positive ways. God allows suffering to exist for a reason. There is a purpose in it, believe it or not, which will lead to a solution. This is in God's plan. It is illustrated in the harrowing example of the Old Testament character Job. This is what we are told about him. God was challenged by an adversary called, in this case, Satan, which is a proper name that shouldn't be there, but somebody that God knew asked this question. Have you considered, or rather God said to the adversary, have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil. And in the next verse, chapter 2 and verse 3, there is no one on earth like him, he is blameless and upright. Again, saying the same things. Man who fears God and shuns evil. And he still maintains his integrity, though you incited me against him to ruin him without any reason. So what is this ruin him without any reason? Well, Job was put to the test in no uncertain livestock, and he was then personally inflicted with swords. He refused to blame God despite being prompted to do so by his wife. He had 3 friends who were hostile, implying that that Job was being repaid for evil. His suffering was arduous, but through perseverance, he came closer to God and the knowledge that salvation comes from him, and a time of future salvation will bring the cure. All problems solved, where there will be the fullest possible realization of the reason God allowed suffering in the first place. Well, Job's endurance was recognized by that New Testament writer James that we looked at earlier, who used him as a model with another group of valiant men. This is chapter 5, and reading from verse 7. He says there, he encourages us to be patient and stand firm because the Lord's coming is near. And that's key to all this. Brothers and sisters, as an example of patience in the face of suffering, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. As you know, we count as blessed those who have persevered. You have heard of Job's perseverance and have seen what the Lord finally brought about. The Lord is full of compassion and mercy. But the key words there are the Lord's coming is near. What did he mean by that? Well, it's the time that the Bible often says his faithful followers with eternal life, immortality. Immortality confers freedom from suffering and all of the ills of mortality. Those who, like Job, have died before that return will be brought back to life. They will be resurrected. And this was Job's confident belief. Sorry, I've left out a verse there. But he said in a later chapter of the book, he said, I know my Redeemer liveth and that he will bring me back to life. Well, as we touched on, Job's fortunes were revived, but he was not the only faithful person to have experienced suffering. The final words of the 11th chapter of the New Testament book of Hebrews has this to say. We'll just see the first few verses there. Speaking of others who were tortured, flogged, they were imprisoned, they were put to death by stoning, they were persecuted, ill-treated, they wandered in deserts and mountains, living in caves and in holes of the ground. And this is the way the writer sums things up. These were all commended for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised, since God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us would they be made perfect. Yes, we're talking there about a joint reward that we can share in and to share with these faithful characters of old. Now, this may strike you as an odd thing to say, but God wants suffering to help those who obey him, to mold their characters, to make them more fitting for Jesus' future kingdom on earth, and arguably to want it even more. Suffering is a discipline, one that is intended to strengthen the bond with those who undergo it, being people who aspire to the title of God's sons and daughters. The next chapter of Hebrews, verses 7 and 11, the writer said this: endure hardship as discipline. God is treating you as his children, for what children are not disciplined by their father? No discipline seems pleasant at the time, but painful. I'm sure all of us would agree with that. Later on, however, it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace for those who have been trained by it. Just as children often fail to immediately see the constructive side of a parent's discipline, so God doesn't expect us to recognize it either. He had this to say through Paul writing to the Corinthians: for our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. So we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but on what is unseen. So what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. God's solutions will come in what is the unseen, the eternal. Yes, Paul, the author, had no doubt about any present difficulties, how they compared, that they were small by comparison to the future reward. Well, this was the conclusion that Jesus reached, seeing beyond the suffering on the cross, having obeyed God in all things prior to his death. It wasn't easy, though. Going back to an earlier chapter of the book of Hebrews, you read there, during the days of Jesus' life on earth, he offered up prayers and petitions with fervent cries and fears to the one who could save him from death, and he was heard because of his reverent submission. Son though he was, he learned obedience from what he suffered, and once made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation for all who obey him. Victory brought him glory. Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 to 2. For the joy that was set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. And that's why in that first verse, we were encouraged to run with perseverance the race marked out for us, to the end that we can share the same reward that he has now. And why is that? Well, because his achievements were not just for himself. Hebrews 5 and verse 9 are once made perfect. He became the source of eternal salvation for all who obey him. Well, those that have been able to follow the PowerPoint presentation here may have noticed one thing about the last 6 slides. They all had the same headline, looking to the future. And this is pivotal to the cure to God's solutions. The saving from suffering for those who obey him will come when Jesus rewards them with immortal life in his kingdom, as I mentioned earlier. God allows suffering now to enable those who accept it and who try their hardest to obey him in all things to enjoy this reward. The cure for pain and suffering will come when Jesus, invested with God's power, sets up his kingdoms on earth. This is what Paul said, again writing to the believers in Rome, chapter 8 and verse 18. And in many ways, it's an echo of that verse we looked at in Corinthians. I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. Yes, it will be so much better. Now, this perspective is gained when you realize that those judged to be worthy will not feel pain, stress, or any kind of suffering, but being immortal will be like God's special servants, the angels. There's a snapshot of this time in the Old Testament through the prophet Isaiah, reading from verse 35. Strengthen the weak, chapter 35, I should say, and reading from verse 3. Strengthen the feeble hands, steady the knees that give way. Say to those with fearful hearts, be strong, do not fear. Your God will come, he will come with vengeance. With divine retribution, he will come to save you. Then will the eyes of the blind be opened and the ears of the deaf unstopped. Then will the lame leap like a deer and the mute tongue shout for joy. Water will gush forth in the wilderness and streams in the desert. Again, I'm a little bit conscious of the fact here that I might have nudged one of the future subjects in this series. So apologies in advance to the presenter if that is the case. The worthy, called the saints, will administer the mortal survivors of God's judgments on those who oppose Jesus as king when he returns to the earth. They will reign with him for 1,000 years. God's ultimate plan at the end of that 1,000 years is something that the seminar media, God willing, will talk about, quite possibly in the last of the 4 subjects in this series. Well, I hope that we may have at least gone some way in the last 30 minutes or so to showing the origins and reasons why pain and suffering exist, some examples of the Bible of those who have endured pain and suffering, that there is a purpose coupled with hope in pain and suffering, and what the solution is, namely a future time when God ensures that pain and suffering will cease to exist. Now, if you wish to be witness to and receive the benefits of God's solutions, then we would urge you to consider further proofs of God's existence and power. And if convinced, obey God and his Son in the ways outlined in his book, the Bible. If you do, you will witness the times spoken of in the last book of the Bible, with which I will bring these comments to a conclusion. And I heard a loud voice. This is Revelation chapter 21, reading verses 3 and 4. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death, or mourning, or crying, or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. Thank you very much for listening. I'll leave the floor open if anyone wants to make a comment.